The story is that they lived in a shtetl, Juliva, I think, I'm not even sure. And my great-grandfather, Rebbe Eliezer, I think for shtetl standards, he did okay. He was a poor man, but by shtetl standards, other people had less than him. And they had this house, and a field, a garden, whatever they had, space. And the family was growing, and he decided that he had to make the house bigger, to add a room or two to the house. His son was already learning in Lubavitch, Fete Yankiv, we call him Fete Yankiv, Uncle Yankel, Fete Yankiv, Yankel Urale. There are Einiklach in Lubavitch from him. The Stamblers are his Einiklach. And he asked the Rebbe Rashab, and the Rebbe Rashab said, yeah, he gave a bracha that they should build. So he started to build. This little village, which was mamish a hole in the wall, had an official agent of the state, whose job it was to, I don't know what, to keep track of something or other. It was a mamish Allah. And he picked on them, and he told them that they don't have a permit to build. I mean, a permit to build in a shtetl, it's like, who cares? It was so primitive, everything was at such a simple level, he was being difficult, he was being a nuisance. So my great-grandfather got nervous. So he wrote another letter to his son and asked the son what he should do. So his son went into the Rebbe Rashab, and the Rebbe Rashab said he shouldn't worry, he should continue to build. So they continued building. The guy was very insulted, so he sued him. He took him to court in the big city for the crime of building without a permit in the shtetl. Where was the big city? If I'm not mistaken, the big city was Pochep. I could be wrong, but I think the big city was Pochep. Because my grandfather used to say that in Pochep there was a Lubavitcher Chassid, the Chassid from the Rebbe Marash, whose name was Rebbe Hesha Note Pocheped. It was a Chassid from the Rebbe Marash. And my grandfather, Olav Shalom, whose yahrzeit it is today, learned by him as a boy. So I'm assuming that that's where the case was, but I don't know for sure. A kid said, the guy made sure that the trial should take place on a Friday, because he knew that Friday is very hard for my great-grandfather, because he's a Shemesh Shabbos. So my great-grandfather went to the city where the case was taking place on Thursday, and he found himself accommodations for Shabbos. And he had no idea how he was going to defend himself. The Rebbe told him to build, he built. Now he's in trouble, he doesn't know what to do. A kid said, so he leaves on Thursday. My grandfather told me the story. He said, I was in the kitchen. He was all of 6, my grandfather. And he was near his mother, who was baking challah, and she was crying. Her name, my Elta Baba, her name was Rachalea. That says my grandfather's mother. My father told me that she used to break ice. She used to break ice to table. You're talking about ladies, real Bali Mesiris Nefesh. She used, in the shtetl where they lived, she used to break ice in the wintertime to table in the mikveh. So my grandfather was next to his mother, and she was crying. He didn't understand everything that's going on. He had an older sister, whose name was Manya. I think she was Maidacham. I think she survived my grandfather. And she ran into the house at some point, all excited that the train ran him over. What happened? The train ran him over. What happened? This officer was standing on the platform. There was no platform. The train came through a shtetl, there was no platform. It was just, you had to climb up steps to get onto the train. And the conductor was talking to him, and he said to him, you need to get onto the train, we're about to leave. He says, nah, because if you were a chevra man, you didn't like to get onto the train like a normal person. You waited for the train to start to move, and then you would grab onto the handlebar and pull yourself up as the train was moving. It was a sign that you were on the ball, that you were not slow. Anyway, he did that, and he got pulled into the wheels. Sunday was his levaya, and the whole town came to the levaya. His wife was walking behind his casket and crying, and she said to him, I told you don't start up with the Jewish people. I told you don't start up. This is the one story that my grandfather had. This is our story. This is our story from Lubavitch in our mishpacha. My grandfather was a very interesting man. He was a very independent. He did everything his own way. He marched to his own drum. He thought things through. He decided how things are supposed to be, and he went ahead and did them. He did not learn in Lubavitch. My Zayde did not learn in Achei Temimim because of the First World War. It was impossible to travel. He learned in Avardik, which was a very, very Elach Litvish yeshiva. And when the revolution happened, he was a teenager, early 20s, late teens. And he saw the changes that were coming, and he made a decision by himself. His decision was that if you want to stay frum in the new world, you have to have an education. Not exactly a Hasidic decision, but this was the decision he made by himself. And he picked himself up when he traveled to Moscow, and he enrolled himself in a school, and he got himself an education. He became an accountant. He worked for the central bank. He lived in Moscow for 20 years, Mistame, until the First World War, Second World War. Then they escaped, and then they came back, and then they left Russia. He was the youngest of 5 children. And the old generation was watching the new generation get lost in an incredible rate. In other words, the world was changing, and Yiddishkeit was falling to pieces. Yiddishkeit was falling to pieces. And my grandfather was the youngest. And when he went to school, his father, Rabbi Eliezer, was hysterical, and he ran to Pachip, and he ran into Heschel Nota, the Mashpia, and said, Boria, Berl is gegangen studieren. You know, his other children, so Feta Yankev learned in Lubavitch, so he was Bala Mesiras Nefesh. The other kids, whatever, each one had their own journey. It's not for now. But my grandfather was the youngest. And he came to the Mashpia and said, my grandfather went to learn at university. He just accepted, understood that this is it. He's going to lose his whole life as a Yid. And the Mashpia said to him, don't worry about Bettel. Bettel will be okay. Mrs. Gorevich was his boss 50 years ago in Beis Rivka seminary, and he was an El Chayid. He was mamish, a self-made man. A very interesting man, I didn't know all this. I was 10 when he passed away, so I knew he was Zayda. You know, I had a young American grandfather and an old Russian grandfather, like everybody has. He was my old Russian grandfather. I loved him. I spent time with him. I talked to him. It's all I remember. I'm sure I discussed many other things with him, but this is my recollections of him. He moved to Moscow. He stayed in Moscow. He married my grandmother probably in 1931, which meant he was alone for 10 years probably. He was born in 1901. He was 30 when they got married. And they lived in Moscow. And he worked for the government. My grandmother they lived on a floor. They lived in what was considered a luxury apartment in Klinikite. So they took one apartment, and they gave, these are apartments that were built before the revolution, for rich people. So every room became a family. They shared a bathroom with a tub, which was considered then one of the greatest luxuries in the universe, and a kitchen. But my grandmother, who my father doesn't even remember, my father doesn't remember his own mother, kept kosher. Her name was Risha. And how do you keep kosher in a kitchen where you're sharing with 3 goyim? So she had her own burner, and they didn't touch it, and they didn't mass it. 2 miracles. Nobody touched her burner, and nobody went and reported that they were keeping kosher. And my father told me that once they heard a neighbor saying to another neighbor about my Zayde, he davens, he prays, which was like one of the worst avedas you could have committed in Russia, especially since my grandfather worked for the central bank. He took his kids to shul. I don't know how he had the nerve to do it. He took his kids to shul. My father was in shul in Moscow. It was so dangerous to take children to shul, especially since he worked for the government. Anyway, the simple fact of the matter is this. I'll tell you one more story. I'm sorry that I'm taking your time with my personal stuff. My father told me that his father told him that he had a dream. And he saw his mother, my great-grandmother, whose name was Rachaleah, and that she was holding a Sefer Torah. And the Sefer Torah was falling out of her hands. She was dropping it. She couldn't hold it. And my grandfather ran over, tried to take it from her, and she wouldn't let. And he wrestled it, and he wrestled it, and he took it from her, and he woke up. Of her 5 children, my grandfather was by far the youngest, and his children are all frum. I mean, it's a story. In other words, it's not just a dream. It's a dream that has a reality to it. Anyway, so today is his yahrzeit. He's Zichrei Baruch. I went to the rebbe this morning, so I said hello to him too. I haven't been there in a while. It's very hard to get into those rows. They're so narrow, it's possible to walk by. I said a kapitel tilim. And I reminded him that we used to hang out together when I was a little boy. He got up in the morning. Ik ben een ältere rid. He was very flu. If he couldn't go to mikveh, he would do Tisha Kabin. If you can't go to mikveh, you go into the shower and you turn it on. Tisha Kabin. He did Tisha Kabin. He put on film. He said Krishma. He took off his film and he sat down and he passed away. It's Ananda Dar, different kind of Jews. Halacha. My son made a book about him many years ago when he was at Bacharel, and he called some of the former students, and a lot of them admitted that they could have been more respectful to him. And they were young American girls, and he was an old Russian rabbi. It worked, but it didn't work perfectly.